The great outdoors can be breathtakingly beautiful, but also deeply unsettling when things go bump in the night. From eerie whispers in the dark to unexplainable figures lurking among the trees, campers and park rangers have experienced some truly terrifying moments in the wild. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more spine-chilling tales. My family used to camp in Algonquin Park in Ontario when I was a kid. We used to do a lot of the day hikes with our dog. The dog was a crazy runner and would run up and down the trail, back and forth between my parents and my brother and me. This one trail ended at a lookout. My brother and I stopped to take in the view, and my dog arrived seconds later, traveling at full speed. He attempted to apply the brakes, but the momentum carried him right over the edge. We freaked out. Our dog had just gone over a cliff, and it was a good 50 or 60 foot drop. I ventured over to the edge to look. My dog had somehow landed on the one ledge that sat about 10 feet down. Shit. Now what? Any movement, and my dog would fall the rest of the way down. It was a sheer face, and no way to get down. Out of the blue, from the trail behind, appears a hiker with full climbing gear. Algonquin is not an area known for a lot of climbing. I've never seen anyone before or since with gear on that trail. This guy belayed down, rescued my dog, packed up, and left. He didn't even stick around long enough to get his name. To all intents and purposes, he just returned to the trail and vanished. When I was about 18, I and some friends took a road trip about 7 hours or so down to the Apalachicola National Forest near Tallahassee, Florida. We were going to do a little car camping and drink a few ice-cold natty lights. You know, 18-year-old stuff. As such, we didn't want to be bothered by any park rangers, so we drove way deep into the woods. Got there, set up camp, had said natty lights, and I and a guy decided to go do a little exploring, so we walked about 100 yards from our site back to the main road, saw another path directly across from us, and started walking. Immediately we started seeing signs that someone had lived there for a while. Big bags of trash, stuff like that. Should have been a huge red flag to turn around. But 18. Nothing could hurt us. So we get to this campsite of an older white guy living out of his van. Clotheslines strung up, coolers placed around it, and a big gorgeous dog, I think maybe a golden retriever. We tried to back out, but he saw us and started talking. He's friendly enough, asks us where we're from, tells us about some cool spots to check out in the park, and we end up chatting for 10 minutes and going on our way. I kept thinking to myself how odd it was that he gave directions in steps, not yards or miles. Guy always seemed to be off balance. Not stumbling drunk, but like he was walking on a balance beam, swaying side to side. Oh, and he was super excited to talk about national parks and forests where we were from. Okay. Camping part over. We went back to our tents. Fast forward 2 months, the same buddy calls me late at night and tells me to turn on the TV to the news. I oblige. I see an old dude with a van. You see where this is headed, but I didn't, so I got pissed at my friend for waking me up. No, watch. And then I see the golden retriever, and it all clicks. What the fuck? That man's name was Gary Michael Hilton, convicted of at least 4 murders. He kidnapped and murdered a girl on Blood Mountain, Georgia, an older couple in the Pisgah, North Carolina, and a girl in the Apalachicola at that campsite not long after we left. Yes, the very same places he had been talking to us about. Obviously we call the cops, they put us in touch with the FBI, F is for Florida, and we get flown down to take investigators to the campsite. Point out every spot we saw anything, tell them exactly what he told us, and show them the places he described to us. I didn't find out until after the trial, but apparently they found what appear to be partially destroyed human finger bones in an area near the site. Had to fly down again to testify. I was camping in the Florida Keys one winter. I managed to survive the large snakes and even larger alligators as well as the scorpions that would get in my shoes at night, but one experience I will never forget. My campsite was next to an old rock quarry, which had filled with water and made a good place for swimming and getting water from. There was also an old dump site close to this quarry with piles of stoves and fridges and other junk. It had been there for a while, but nothing new had been added to it for a long time. One day a fellow shows up and tells me that they were going to clean up the dump and burn some of the junk, so I better move my tent. So I gathered up all of my belongings and moved a few hundred yards back into the woods. That day they started burning the garbage, and I thought nothing about it until I climbed into my tent at night. As soon as it got dark and I was falling asleep, my tent became covered with hundreds of rats. I guess they had moved out of the dump because of the fire and were just wandering around looking for food. They were everywhere, climbing up my ropes and over the top of the tent. I shook as many as I could off and started a fire and stayed up all night hoping they wouldn't return. They seemed to be gone, so the next night I stayed in the same place, thinking they had moved on to another dump or something, but no, again as it got dark, they all returned, bringing some of their friends, as it seemed there were more than ever now. I again shook them off the tent and got a fire going. When the morning came, I packed up my tent and headed for a new place far from those rats. As I was walking down the highway wondering if I should return to another camping spot where I had been previously, there on the highway near to that place was a dead 11-foot alligator that had crawled out from the mangroves only a few feet from where I had been camping a few weeks previously. I decided my Florida camping adventure had gone on long enough and headed back home. A few years back we were doing a massive survey in the middle of nowhere in the interior of BC. All the crew had gone home, and it was just my boss and myself left for a few days to follow up and confirm some coordinates and finish some mapping. We head out from the motel an hour or so into the bush. Middle of nowhere along deactivated logging roads. The closest town is miles and miles away. We hiked out to this one area where we had found a site a few weeks previously. For some reason the whole area just felt off. So, we get down to business, and about 15 minutes after being hunched over mapping, there is this weird, deafening whomp sound. Like, I could feel pressure in my ears. I immediately looked at my boss about 20 feet away, and he was as white as a ghost, staring back at me. Standing, it fucking happens again, whomp. Ear pressure and chest pressure like I was just squeezed. Chills all over my body, and every hair is standing on end. My boss just looks at me and says, "Let's go." We grab all of our shit and speed hike back to the truck. We never discussed it. No clue what it was, but I have never been so freaked out in my life. 10 years later, I still get the chills. When I was young, from ages 5 to 11, my dad lived in an old log cabin about 15 miles west of Sheridan, Wyoming, in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. Every summer when I was visiting, we would go up into the mountains backpacking and fishing for 2 days every weekend. We would park the truck, hike into a remote area fishing for trout along the way, and make camp wherever we ended up. We encountered a number of strange/creepy things and got into some scary situations with wildlife, but the one that sticks with me the most was an ancient abandoned camp we found. We were hiking down a very steep slope to get to an area of a creek that had been dammed up by beavers, hoping to catch some big trout. I had climbed out on a rock ledge and was looking for a way down when I saw the stock and action of an old rusty rifle sticking out of a tree, where the tree had grown around the barrel years before, about 10 above the ground. Dad and I climbed down to check it out, and we found a small cave at the base of the rock formation, only about 12 deep, which would make a nice natural shelter but a really terrible place to set up a long-term camp. Inside we found a bunch of really old stuff, 3 heavy-gauge unopened cans of food, an old cast-iron pot that had holes rusted all the way through it, a crusty old saddle and bridle set, and a very deteriorated heavy wool blanket rolled up and tied with a leather belt. When we unwrapped the blanket, we found several personal items, including a rusty old cap and ball black powder revolver, a leather satchel with lead pistol shot, a powder horn with no black powder in it, tarnished old cartridges, presumably for the rifle in the tree, a straight razor, and most unsettling, a shirt with holes in it and over half of it stained with dried blood. As we stood there thinking about what all of this meant, it occurred to me how remote this place was even at that time. It was July of 1985, and the fact that whoever owned that shirt had been very seriously injured, stuck on a steep slope in the middle of absolutely nowhere, gave me serious chills down my spine. The only thing that somewhat dated this fateful campsite was the pistol and the rifle, both of which were made sometime in the 1870s, according to my father. There's no way to ever know what happened to the man who owned all this stuff, but the fact that he or someone he knew was obviously shot twice with either a gun or arrows and all his belongings were sitting right where he left them possibly 100 years later, it was highly unlikely he left that area alive. Discovering what amounts to a 100-year-old crime scene in the very remote wilderness kind of gave me the creeps. But mostly, it just made me sad to know how hopeless and alone this guy must have felt when he died. Just a few weeks ago we were on a road trip from BC to San Diego, and we came upon a campsite just outside of Crescent City, California. We drove through. One side of the campground was relatively empty. I noticed a few scattered tents, but nobody close to the location we ended up picking. We had tons of space. We wanted an early night, so I started a fire while my girlfriend started cooking. We ate, had a few beers, and climbed up to our rooftop tent, Tepui, with our dog by 9 p.m. or so. I had a rough time sleeping and woke up a few times but finally fell into a decent sleep. In the pitch dark with all of our tent windows and canvases closed, I was awoken at 1 a.m. by someone whistling outside of our tent the tune of When the Saints Come Marching In. After a few minutes of this repetitive whistling, I nudged my girlfriend, who awoke and was obviously freaked out as well. The whistling then turned to chanting things like, "When you sleep here, you disrespect me, and when you disrespect me, you disrespect the US Marines." The person would then start spelling out words like FLEE. The verbiage and tone kept getting more aggressive, so we decided we had to make a move. I slowly unzipped the tent while our guard dog was snoring and got my head out of the tent. I took a few seconds to let my eyes adjust and figure out where the person was. I felt more confident once I could somewhat see and hear, so I climbed down, and the girlfriend passed me the dog, and she climbed down too. We flipped the tent up without securing it, and we jumped into a truck, while the person was still whistling, to a motel in Crescent City. The next morning we drove back to get the few belongings that weren't in the truck, and a family who had been camping a few sites over said it went on for another 2 to 3 hours, and it was the scariest thing their family had ever experienced. My dad was up camping in Canada. He was sleeping naked in his tent in a patch of woods near some train tracks. A bear cub came rustling up and messing with the tent. My dad, who had long hair and a beard at the time, grabs a long Bowie knife and runs outside the tent, noticing the bear cub. Where the bear cub is, Mama Bear is nearby. He backs up near the train tracks just as an early morning freight train comes by. He could see the engineer looking at him in horror, thinking this long-haired, bearded hippie with a big knife was going to try to hijack the train. He got a visit from the Mounties later that day inquiring if he had seen any angry hippies with weapons around. Went hiking with a good buddy of mine in the Carolina mountains in the middle of winter. We went way off trail, doing a full day's walk from where we'd parked, so by the time we set up camp, we were miles away from the nearest human. We pitch our tent and cook ourselves some food, and we're passing the whiskey flask back and forth, enjoying the near pitch black night and the stillness and our little fire. At first we felt it, that sudden sensation of being not alone. Then after a few seconds, we heard something move in the darkness. We're frozen. We hear it again, but the most terrifying thing is that this time, we realize whatever is out there, there's more than one of them, and they're big. My buddy and I lock eyes, too afraid to make any noise yet, and come to a silent agreement that scaring these things off is our best chance. He grabs a thick branch from the fire, and I grab one of the rocks we'd placed in a circle around it. I'm so scared I can barely breathe, but together we yell as loudly as we possibly can and charge into the darkness. And then we saw the eyes, a dozen pairs at least, staring right back at us. We had charged a ferocious pack of mountain ponies, who didn't react at all to the two crazy men yelling at the top of their lungs in the middle of the night, just stared back at us, totally unimpressed. Motherfucking ponies. On a road trip with a friend, and we hiked into a trail in Colorado one evening to camp so we wouldn't have to pay for a campsite. Found a little clearing by a stream, my friend set up a tent while I decided to sleep under the stars. Right as we were getting ready to go to sleep, another woman showed up and pitched her tent in the clearing as well. I hadn't been feeling well that day, plus we had the hike in with all our stuff, so when I slept hard. Woke up to a ranger shaking me and asking if I saw where the bear went. Bear? What bear? Then I look up and see the woman's tent just shredded. Turns out she had left her food in her tent that night. We hung ours from a tree, and a curious bear came by at like 4 a.m. to have a snack. In tearing into her tent, it ended up raking its claws across her forehead as well. She decided to get out, though why she didn't bother waking either me or my friend up to let us know about this very hungry bear nearby, I don't know. Anyway, a pretty freaky thing to wake up to. Camping with 2 friends, middle of the night, all 3 of us inside a square dome tent, just chilling out, chatting, lights are on. One side of the wall begins to cave inward, as if there's a strong wind or something/one pushing on the side of the tent. Everyone is freaking, but I assume wind, chill the fuck out, guys. Proceeds to jump up and punch the tent wall. Connect with something/one, the feeling of punching flesh is unmistakable. Now I freak the fuck out. What/who did I just punch through the tent wall? Convince friends it's smartest to have a look outside the tent, but it's 15 minutes later by the time they agree, and there's nothing there. When I was a kid, about 12 or so, my dad would always wake me up in the middle of the night to go hunting. I fucking hate hunting. A few weeks prior to this night, I saw an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark about the Jersey Devil. I was on edge because I knew my dad would make me go hunting soon, and we sometimes hunt in Jersey. Sure as shit, he wakes me up one morning at like 3 a.m., and we are off to the woods in Jersey in pitch black so that he could be there and all set up before the deer come out. I'm up in the stand, starting to calm down, when I see a little figure on the ground. It's human, with a face I can barely make out since it's a bit far in the distance, but I know it's human, and it's like 2 to 3 feet tall. I'm losing my shit but don't want to say anything because I know my dad will just tell me to suck it up. I stare at this fucker for at least 4 hours until we get down from the stand and walk towards it to leave. It's a fucking lawn gnome. Miles and miles into the deep woods. There are no roads for a long while and certainly no houses. How the fuck did a gnome get there? The stand we were in wasn't even a permanent stand. It was one we put up when we got there. Wasn't exactly in the woods, no trees, but it was camping in the high Arctic in the middle of nowhere. Late at night while I was in my tent, I'd hear the sound of pebbles rolling down the side of the nearby slope. It was intermittent, like something was walking down the slope. You might think, so what? But polar bears might be a possibility. They aren't to be messed with, being one of the nastiest predators on Earth and quite happy to hunt and eat people. This is not an exaggeration. I'd get up and look outside the tent. Nothing. Nothing at all. It sounds like a simple thing to do, but believe me, when you're wondering about whether it's a polar bear out there, it is not simple to unzip a tent and stick your head out. Even with a shotgun in hand, you're wondering if you're going to turn it in the right direction quick enough. Polar bears are stealthy and fast hunters. Anyway, I'd go back to sleep, and an hour or two later, wake up again to the sound of pebbles. It was really freaking me out. It took several nights of this before I finally figured out what was going on. In the high Arctic in summer, there is 24 hours of sunlight. The sun dips slightly at night but basically goes around in a circle. At a certain time of the night, the sun was falling directly on the slope near the camp. The sunshine would warm it up, thawing the frost that was holding the pebbles together, and they'd start cascading down the slope. The rest of the day it would be in shade, cold, and quiet. So, mundane explanation, but was I ever freaked out? Worst of it was, once I was satisfied that it was an irrelevant natural phenomenon, I kept thinking, okay, but what if a real polar bear shows up? Will I dismiss it as mere pebbles and not have the shotgun ready when it tears into my tent? I didn't sleep well until we moved camp. I've been camping my whole life, it's what I did for fun a lot of the time growing up. Thankfully I found a wife who is into it also, and we've done a ton of backpacking/camping together. A few years ago we were in the middle of nowhere in Maine, backpacking in the day and then just walking off the trail into the woods to sleep at night. We're carrying about 10 days worth of food and are deep in the woods, we haven't seen another person in a few days. This is our primary goal, to get away from it all. Normally I like to just sleep under the stars, but it was drizzling a bit, so we set up our tiny 2-person tent and went to sleep. Around sunrise I wake up and am sitting right outside the tent putting my boots on while my wife is still asleep. About 30 feet from our tent, I see this dude just standing there looking at me. He was right out of central casting for Creepy Dude Who Murders Campers. I said something stupid to him like good morning, please don't eat us, and he just looked at me for a few seconds and turned around and walked into the woods. We were out there for another 4 days after this, and I kept waiting for him to jump out from behind every fallen log. I still have no clue how this dude found us or what his deal was. I think about him a lot, trying to figure out what life path led him to our tent that morning. My family and I were camping on a lake in central Texas on a week with very few people around. Our spot was on the edge of the camp next to the woods and very close to the edge of the lake. We were playing Pictionary by the campfire the first night we were there when I saw a light go by over the lake. I didn't think much of it and was still focusing on the game when another one went by at the same speed, following the same line. At that point I felt a little bit strange but still wasn't too worried about it. After that, another went by, and now I pointed out, and my dad said he noticed it as well. We walk out past the campfire and campground lights to get a better view of what these were. They continued to fly by over the lake, going the same speed and staying the exact same distance from each other. They were reddish-yellow orbs, and there was no sound coming from them. Now my whole family is watching in awe and disbelief. After about 15 go by, the last one was chased by a white ball of light that was much closer than the rest. We didn't talk about it much after discussing what it could be, but when we got back home from the trip, my mom looked it up and saw that people in a town a few miles from our campsite reported seeing the same thing exactly the way we saw it. Was in the Watagan MTS in NSW, Australia in 2006. The camp we chose is a beautiful spot that is tucked in underneath some impressive sandstone cliffs in some very dense and remote country. Roughly 30 people were staying in the same campsite as us, spread out over about 10 sites. I was there with my GF and a few friends. We had chatted with a few other campers the night before and enjoyed getting drunk and singing songs around a fire. Early in the morning, but still dark, I awake to the most deafening rumbling noise you can imagine. Mixed with this sound are loud cracking noises that sound like fireworks. It goes on for about 20 seconds and then abruptly stops. My GF is awake too, And before we can ask each other what the hell it was, we hear all the campers around us calling out to see if everyone is okay. We get up and join everyone else in the camp as we all gather together to try and figure out what we heard. Everyone is freaked out and very confused, as we all heard the same thing, and it was bloody loud. A few of us take our torches and head in the direction from where the noise came. About 100 meters from the camp, we quickly discover the source. A chunk of sandstone that formed the cliffs around us had broken free and fallen down the side of the mountain. In the morning we went to have a good look and found a chunk of rock about the size of 5 school buses sitting at the bottom of the valley with a path of destruction in its wake. The cracking noise had been trees snapping like twigs as the rock took them out on the way down. Needless to say, we felt very lucky and humbled by the sheer scale of the event. This ended up being funny, but at the time, it freaked me out at first. My wife and I were camping in one of the national forests in the mountains in NC. We were in a campground, but there were not a lot of people there, and the spots were semi-private because of trees and foliage. So we had just settled down in the tent, and I was just falling asleep when, through my eyelids, the whole tent lights up. I jump up and go out of the tent, thinking someone is messing around. Not a soul or any noise, nothing. I go back and lie down, and just as I'm falling asleep again, it happens a second time. Same routine jump up check, and nothing. So this time, I lie down but stay awake and have the tent unzipped, ready to jump out and catch whoever is shining a light on the tent when it all lights up again. And I saw what was doing it right away. Fireflies were landing en masse on the tent, and then they would all light up at once. I guess when I would jump up, they would fly off, then settle down again after I got quiet. I had a good chuckle over that one in the end. 2 tents, next to each other about 5 feet apart, in the middle of the mountains. Had my 3 little brothers in one tent and me and my GF in the other. It's nighttime, and we have just put the fire out, so it's dark. Everyone is in their respective tents, snoozing off into dreamland. About an hour later I'm the only one awake, just daydreaming. Suddenly I hear soft, human-like footsteps circling our tents over and over. Confused, I ask who's there with no response but continued footsteps, so I stepped outside. No one, footsteps stop. I go back into my tent. Footsteps start again. I make my presence known and go back out. No one, footsteps stop. Of course I check on my brothers, but they are asleep and sound. I repeat this same process about 4 to 5 more times, believe it or not, lol. Footsteps always stopped. Ended up just going to sleep to the footsteps and not giving a fuck. When morning came, I asked my brothers how they slept, and they responded with, fine, except for you walking, loudly, all around the goddamn campsite all night. Not my story, but my dad's. My father used to have a business in maintaining the woods, couldn't find an English term. It is a thing in my country. It basically means cutting down dead trees and hauling them out of the area. This meant that he was out in the woods all day, and he was allowed in places normal citizens couldn't come because of rules by the Forestry Commission. My dad was working in the early morning when he suddenly noticed a car in the middle of the woods. It drove through a small path normally only used by the forester. It wasn't a car from the commission, so he thought it was very weird that it was there. However, Dad was alone, and it was the 80s. No mobile phones to contact anyone. Since it was in the middle of nowhere, he decided to ignore it. He kept on hauling wood through the woods with his horse when he suddenly heard men speaking. Now, my dad is a brave man and as strong as a bear, so he decided to just take a quick peek to see what the hell those folks were doing. My dad looked around some thick bushes, making sure he could see the men. They were digging a hole. My father decided that it was something that he really wouldn't want to interrupt, and he kept working throughout the day like nothing ever happened. He made sure to keep some distance between him and the digging site. The men apparently never noticed my dad. Possibly because his equipment wasn't located in the direction the men came from and my father worked with horses, so there weren't any loud machines. It was the 80s after all. At the end of the day, my father got to the local commission office and reported it. They called the police. There was a body of a young woman buried there. It still irks my dad to this day. He was out alone there. What if the man saw him? What if he decided to check the burial ground out himself? Scary shit. A few friends and I do a yearly camping trip in the Manistee National Forest in northern Michigan. One year we decided to try a new spot by the river for easier access for fishing, kayaking, etc. Needless to say, this spot was very remote. We had to backpack in and drag our kayaks through the woods. This is all state land, so it's basically find a spot and set up wherever. It was early June at the time, so we weren't worried about people out there hunting or anything like that. We arrived during the day on our first day there. Set up our tents and hit the river for the rest of the afternoon. Got back right before dark and started a fire. Everything is peaceful, nice, and quiet until all of a sudden a big glowing fire about 300 yards away. We start to hear chanting and look a little closer and notice the glowing seems to be a burning cross. About 5 minutes later, gunfire erupts, and I mean erupts. There must have been at least 10 different guns going off just non-stop. The gunfire stops, and we hear white power being yelled by, I'm guessing, at least 20 people. We left all our stuff and noped the fuck out of there real quick. Went back the next day and got our tents and boats, and nobody was in the area where they were that night. I'm not convinced there is an afterlife, or such a thing as ghosts or demons. But I once saw something in the woods that felt so unnatural it made me second guess how I see the world. I was hiking up a hillside, thick with trees, in the middle of the night during a long weekend. Some friends and I decided we would hike to the top of the hill and light off some fireworks. Approaching the hill and surrounding the base of this hill was a rolling grass valley. It was around midnight, a full moon and light mist. Straight out of a horror movie. The strange part was I wasn't nervous or scared or anything. I was having a great night with my buddies. I didn't have any of my defenses up. My buddies and I just hiked in a straight line through the rolling grass valley approaching the hill when something caught my eye. On my right, I saw a tall, shadowy figure standing perfectly upright on the top of a small grassy hill. It was standing there right next to a large dead tree. I couldn't make out any details, both the tree and the tall figure were silhouetted under the moonlight. The strange part was seeing this figure didn't scare me. I didn't immediately sense any threat. I almost assumed it might have been just another hiker or somebody having a smoke. I passively turned my flashlight on it, and that's when it happened. In an instant, as my light hit that spot where this figure was standing, it instantly moved just outside of the range of my flashlight. Like it teleported or something. But just as vividly as I saw it standing in its initial spot, as my light hit that spot and the figure moved, I could see it standing just outside the range of my light. My breath paused. In an instant a wave of dread washed over me. Something felt 100% unnatural about what just happened. As a reflex I moved my light to the new spot where the figure was, and as my light passed it, it disappeared. I've never passed out in my entire life, not from heat, not from getting knocked out, never. But in that moment I felt my knees give way from under me, and I just fell to the ground. My friends turned and looked at me trying to pick myself up, and my knees were too wobbly to stand. They helped me, and I tried explaining to them what I experienced. I'm willing to bet it was all just light/shadows playing games with my eyes. But I'll never be able to explain that sensation I felt of feeling like I had just seen something I shouldn't have seen, something so unnatural that my body's instinctual reaction to it was to go limp. I used to spend a lot of time solo camping in and around the Indian Peaks wilderness in CO and experience some weird stuff. Nothing that was outright supernatural, but just unsettling. I love those woods, but they give me the creeps. Here are some notable examples from 4 to 5 trips up there in all seasons. 1. After thinking that a particular area under a tree and against a rock looked like a great place to set up for the night, I found a shredded sleeping bag and old, must have been 20 years or more, camp supplies. Found a lot of bones around the site too, ribs and vertebrae, probably elk, but maybe not. I camped elsewhere. 2. Found a deer skull out in the middle of recently, frozen over lake/pond. Major snow the night before, and the skull was sitting on top of the fresh powder with no tracks anywhere I could see and no other bones. Odd. 3. Woke up to a squirrel literally nailed to a tree outside my shelter. I had made camp late and tired and in dying light, so I might not have noticed it the night before, but I think I would have, which means it happened sometime while I was asleep. I have more if anyone cares. I love it up there, especially in the national park off-season, and the remoteness of the area is why I go, but it means that when weird things happen, they're that much weirder. File this under unsettling but not creepy or supernatural. 17 or 18 years ago, my fiancée, now wife of nearly 16 years, I, and one other couple were hiking the Pyramid Point hiking trail in the Sleeping Bear Dunes of the northwestern Lower Peninsula of Michigan at dusk. We had my old film camera with a 200mm zoom lens on it. We got to the overlook, which looks northwest over the Manitou Passage to the Manitou Islands. We watched the sunset and entered that late dusk period that seems to last forever during a northern Michigan summer. It was probably 10 p.m. at this point. There were high winds and solid waves breaking on shore below us. The Pyramid Point overlook is maybe 150 to 200 above Lake Michigan, but it didn't look any rougher than many evenings on Lake Michigan, where 5 breaking waves are fairly routine, and windy nights and crashing waves provide great white noise for sleeping in a tent. We were camping elsewhere. There's no camping at this trail. While standing and talking, we saw a light flash once out in the water between the islands and the mainland, in the vicinity of the North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse, a crib lighthouse standing alone in the water, not inhabited or staffed but tempting for visitors, I would assume, not sure, though. We stopped and looked but weren't creeped out by it at all. After all, boaters are out in this stretch of water fairly regularly, though not in high winds and waves. I grabbed my camera to look through the zoom lens and could make out what appeared to be a small boat, though it was difficult to tell with a 200mm lens. It's a 7-mile wide stretch of water to the nearest island, so we were probably 3 to 4 miles away from the actual light. We had flashlights, so we shined our light, which from several miles away might not have even been visible, in the direction of the light we'd seen and waved it around. Immediately the light came back and started flashing SOS in Morse code, which was a huge surprise to us. We weren't even sure our lights were bright enough to be seen at that distance, and given that the stretch of shore is almost all forested, we were just a little spot, several miles away. We were suddenly full of adrenaline and concern. 2 of us ran back to the car, half a mile through the woods, in the dark, down a hill with our flashlight, and got a cell phone and binoculars. While we were gone, the folks on the lookout had no light source. At the car, we called the Coast Guard from our cell phones. It was 1998 or 1999. So these weren't smartphones by any stretch of the imagination. We explained to the Coast Guard that someone was flashing SOS at us out in the water and that we were hikers observing this from the Pyramid Point overlook. They said they'd send a ship to look over the area, and we asked them to hurry. At this point we ran back up to our overlook, half a mile, up a steep hill, with binoculars, our phone, and our flashlight. Atop the overlook there was no cell signal, so we had to pocket the phone and had no further communication with the Coast Guard. With our binoculars, we were able to see a guy in an aluminum rowboat, rowing like crazy with waves breaking over the bow of his boat. It was nearly pitch black outside, so we were only barely able to make this out. Maybe it was 10:30 or 10:45 at this point, and during Michigan summer, it's still light enough outside to see well. He would occasionally turn around, flash SOS at us, and go back to rowing. It was disturbing to be several miles away, completely helpless, while we watched this guy struggling in a rowboat in the dark. It got dark. We could not see anything anymore, but every few minutes the man in the boat would flash SOS at us. He did not appear to be making any progress toward the mainland, but he was clearly drifting northward through the Manitou Passage. Every time he flashed, we'd turn on our flashlight, shine it back at him for a few seconds, and turn it off. We did not know Morse code, and we had no cell signal. We stood and watched for what seemed like forever, completely helpless. The man stopped flashing his light. It was too dark to see his boat. A tugboat, which didn't appear to be a Coast Guard ship, showed up and started doing a grid search pattern through the passage with bright lights shining from the boat into the water. The Manitou Passage is probably 6 to 7 miles wide and 6 to 7 miles long, so it was a slow search. A smallish Coast Guard ship started doing searches at the northern end of the straits, also with bright lights. They met in the middle of the straits, having done a zigzag-type pattern for what felt like an eternity. Then they sailed off. They did not appear to find anyone. We drove to a bar in Glen Arbor to see if there was anything on the news. There wasn't. We called the Coast Guard the next day, wondering if we'd see a man die or help a rescue, or neither, but the person on duty had no idea what had happened, shift change perhaps? Or that we'd even called the night before. To this day it's unsettling to me. Knowing how harsh the conditions can be on Lake Michigan and knowing that we'd seen a man flashing SOS at us through our binoculars just before it got dark was really bothersome, though not as bothersome as the poor guy in the boat who had to be wondering why we weren't doing anything for him. No closure. No happy or sad ending. No ending at all really other than going back to our camp and hitting the sack. Just a few weeks ago we made our way to a very remote valley that is very difficult to access. Think walking on 1-inch ledges, dropping into narrow crevasses, etc. The valley ends in a sharp drop with a waterfall that is about 100 feet high. We were almost at the drop when we heard a whistle. It sounded a lot like a hiking whistle, but we only met one group of people the entire day, and they had stopped way before we did as they thought the mountain slope was not passable. According to our calculations, that group should have long left and headed back to the base camp, so it made no sense. Then we heard another whistle. We yelled hello. And immediately we heard a whistle back. The whistle was coming up from the thick trees up on the very steep slope of the mountains encircling the valley. The slope was about 75 to 80 degrees. The only way we could make it up there would be if we were pulling ourselves up by tree branches and roots because it was so steep. Just as we were debating whether the whistle was indeed a hiker's whistle, a helicopter suddenly rose from behind the waterfall. It rose right above us, then turned around and flew away. It was an unmarked helicopter, and the nearest airfield is about 100 miles away. We figured they had to have a search mission out for someone, so that must have been a hiker's whistle. However, it was strange that the person would whistle repeatedly but never yell back. We yelled again, the whistle recurred. Suddenly, we heard the helicopter rotor again. Not 3 to 4 minutes later, we saw the helicopter rise above the valley again, hover for about 30 seconds, then fly away over the mountain. We went ahead and crossed the creek to climb the mountain slope. We scrambled up, grabbing onto roots and branches. The whistling ceased. We yelled a few times, and there was no response. It took us 4 hours to make our way out of there after. The bushes were so thick that at times we walked on branches above the ground, and I could not see my hand in front of me. I still have no idea who was whistling. It was a very mechanical whistle. I've been out in the wilderness quite a few times and have never heard a bird whistle that was anywhere close to that. While prospecting out here in the Caribou region, I came across a set of rock piles known as Chinese piles out in the middle of nowhere. These being here means someone did a lot of digging back in the old days, so I started working, and after half an hour, I had about 10 grams of gold and was having a happy dance when I noticed the small standing stones on each of the rock walls. Each stone had several Chinese characters on them, and in a moment of dread, I realized they were graves. I put the gold in a glass bottle I found nearby and left it behind. I also took down drawings of the symbols to show a local historian, who later confirmed my suspicions that yes, they were graves, and they likely hadn't been seen in 150 years. Chinese miners believed that if a miner died on site, the ground became cursed by the fallen miner's spirit, so they wouldn't continue to mine the area and would tell anyone they met that the area was worked out. Sometimes they would also do extra work to make the site look finished off so people wouldn't end up digging up their comrades. I've been back several times, but I won't dig there out of respect. The site is super creepy in the morning fog. You can almost see people's outlines sitting around the piles. One of the stories my boss out here told me about was when he got involved with some sketchy folk from Prince George back in the 70s and went with them looking for some mining gear to steal so they could claim jump a site a few kilometers down the road. My boss went down this forgotten path into a clearing with 2 ancient bulldozers and a small cabin. The rest went to the bulldozers to see if they ran while my boss went into the cabin and was greeted by a skeleton lying on the bed with a bullet hole through his head. They brought in the cops, and they figured the guy had been there since 1935 since that was the last date on the newspapers inside. I went to the same cabin with him a few weeks back and found the place had been burned down by squatters. My uncle owns land in Zion Ponderosa Ranch in Utah, so 4 of us went to go camp there for my birthday weekend. Zion Ponderosa Ranch is kind of like a camping community in the woods. There's a bunch of families there, and they all know each other, and it's a pretty friendly little place. Everyone knows who owns what part of the land and stuff. While we were camping, this average-looking hillbilly-looking dude came to introduce himself to us. He told us his name was Brian and that he was staying up the road in a cabin. Nothing too weird, so we welcome him and give him a couple beers and feed the dude some tacos. A friend of ours, let's call him Tim, who owns land next to us, came over to hang out. Tim knows everyone around but has never seen this person before. This time Brian introduces himself to Tim as Justin, maybe a middle name? Mystery dude excuses himself to feed his neighbor's cat and leaves on his ATV like a bat out of hell and comes back in 5 minutes completely drenched wet. We didn't ask any questions. In the 5 minutes that this dude was gone, another neighboring family came over and asked, since we were hanging out with the guy, if we could tell him to be more careful since the family had children running around. Completely understandable. The dude comes back, and we tell him about the family's concerns and that his driving could be a danger to the children. Fuck the kids. Who the fuck are they to tell me what to do? Replies, weirdo. That was more than we were comfortable with, so we politely asked him to leave because he was drinking a lot and had a gun, and we didn't know this dude. We were all already uncomfortable. He apologizes and leaves back to his cabin or whatever. Less than a minute later we hear gunshots coming from his direction. We all kind of freak out a bit. And guess who comes back to greet us? Morgan Freeman. Not really. That same freaky dude tried to apologize, and we asked him about the gunshots, and he replied with, so you heard gunshots? So what? And so my girlfriend was getting really frightened by this guy, and so we decided to use my uncle's ATV for a ride while leaving my uncle to talk to this dude. I blocked out their convo, but I definitely heard him say that he needed to take a Hitler stance on the subject so they wouldn't walk all over them and destroy the country. When we got back, the dude was gone, and we went to sleep for the night. At 4 a.m. I was woken up to the sound of an ATV coming very close to our camp and stopping there for a while before going back to the same direction he came from. I'm like 90% sure it was from the direction of the crazy dude's cabin. In the morning we went to the administrator's office to warn about the weird guy, and no one seemed to know about this guy at all. Never saw him again for the next few days we were there. I'll have a go at the supernatural aspect of this question. This was maybe 7 to 8 years ago when I was 20 and in a really bad way. I'd been fucking my life up via heroin for the past year, but after lots of help/love/luck from friends and family, I was finally getting my head cleared, almost there, above the black tar hell I'd gotten myself into. I decided to get out of the city and drove 2 hours out to a smaller town in Missouri where Google Maps told me a small campsite by water was. I knew there shouldn't be very many campers because it had just gotten cold, about 40 or so at night. Nearly there, as I'm driving down a misty morning road, just a picturesque straight 2-lane highway, there's this object lying in the road about a half-mile up. I slow my approach and can see it's this shaggy mutt, just hanging out. I stopped and rolled down my window right next to it. She came up, licked my hand, and wagged her tail a bit. She seemed to expect something of me. She had no tag, no tattoo for a chip, I later checked, just a dog with no name. Naturally, I popped open the passenger side door for her, and she was glad to hop in. So now I got this dirty but friendly companion for my little excursion, the dog with no name. The entrance to the campsite was only a half-mile further, and as I suspected, there was no one around. I just dropped a 5 in the honor box and picked the site closest to the stream. I set up my tent, the same one I'd set up for years with my dad as a kid, collected some dry sticks, not hard to do this time of year, and started a fire. The dog with no name just circled the campsite, looking content enough to sniff some leaves and roll around in the mud. I'd gone to check out the rivulet, about 30 feet wide. It had a man-made stone dam you could walk across. To the west was the deeper part of the river, sort of pooling at the dam, then maybe an 8-foot drop to the east into calmer streams. Instantly, I wanted to go on, cleanse myself, symbolize, baptize, or whatever. I grew up Catholic, so that kind of shit runs through my head to this day, though I'm far from religious. The dog sees me scoping it out the whole time from the campsite. I can't bring myself to do it, though. I'm hugely disappointed in myself, but it's cold, it's brackish, and I don't have a towel. So I go back up to smoke cigarettes, eat hot dogs, and pet the dog with no name. Night falls quickly after all this meditation, and I roll inside the tent to sleep. My buddy sleeps inside the tent next to the sleeping bag. This dog was fucking awesome, if you couldn't tell that yet. I wake up for no reason I can put my finger on, and my main source of warmth, dog with no name, is missing. I slide out of the tent, I guess I left it unzipped? And there she is, just sitting, waiting for me in pitch black, wagging her tail. I feel very strange, like something is happening here, and someone/something is telling me to get back down to the river and do the damn thing. We walk down the short trail together, surrounded by Missouri black. It's even colder than before, but I start to strip anyway, standing on the chilly stones of the dam. The dog with no name sits on the edge of the river, again, just watching me, a slight wag. I'm now as stark naked as can be, staring into this black pool that looks like some supernatural ink. I should mention here that I hate swimming in water I can't see the bottom of. My fearful imagination takes over, and I freak out. In other words, I stand naked on the dam for over 10 minutes before I finally muster up the balls, albeit shriveled and tiny balls, to say fuck it and dive into the blackness. It was cold as hell, it was scary as fuck. When I came up for air, I was thrashing wildly back towards the dam, scrambling back onto the slick stones. I shook out my hair and was surprised how the adrenaline helped me in keeping warm. As I pick up my clothes and shoes, I look over for my buddy at the river's edge. The dog with no name is nowhere in sight. Back up at the campsite, I'm looking around, gently whistling, that kind of thing. I'm more than woken up now, so I go ahead and start another fire. Dawn is just starting to break. I have another hot dog for breakfast and figure I might as well just pack it up and leave. This trip feels more than complete. As I start my car up and check my phone, there is an hour time difference between the two. This happened to fall on daylight savings time. I'm not calling it a supernatural rip in time, but it is funny that the night this went down, in fact, the exact time would be around 3 to 4 a.m. that the dog disappeared. So the dog never showed up again. I never shot up heroin again. I went camping with a summer program when I was 16. 12 other guys were being managed by 4 adult men, and we were having a great time. S'mores, hot cocoa, campfire stories, the works. We all had to be in our tents and either sleeping or awake but quiet by 11. I was in a tent with 2 other guys, staying up later just talking, typical teenage guy stuff. As one guy is talking, I start to hear heavy breathing nearby. Like someone has just been running and is out of breath. I ignore it and keep listening. I figure I'm just a weird kid hearing things. Or that it's one of the guys in the next tent making the noise while he's sleeping. Then we hear, "Please, help, me," from outside. It didn't sound like anyone in the group. It sounded like an old man out of breath. We all went dead quiet and listened to this guy breathe, then asked again with a whimper at the end. I don't know what possessed this guy near the front of this tent, but he turned on a flashlight and opened the inner flap but kept the outer zipped and looked out. We see just a pair of bare, old, scabbed, and pale legs standing there. It looked like this guy had been walking nude through the woods for some time. He asked for help but kept standing there. We were all paralyzed with fear, but the guy at the front managed to say, "Keep walking down the trail. A ranger should be around soon." The guy stopped breathing and said, "No. No rangers. They keep me here." It was at this point someone else finally spoke up. A chaperone came out of his tent with a flashlight and cautiously asked him, "How long have you been out here? What happened to you?" The old man didn't answer. He just started sobbing and ran off into the woods. We saw by the flashlight that he was completely naked and emaciated. Camping with family/friends up in the mountains. Sharing a tent with my brother, call him Luke, and another friend, call him Evan. Luke, Evan, and I weren't tired when everyone retreated to their tents for the night, but the fire was dimming out and we were bored, so we went inside our tent to watch Adventure Time on my laptop till it died. We all passed out after a few episodes, and I woke up sometime during the night into an episode of sleep paralysis. I have weird sleep habits and experience sleep paralysis every few months or so. For those who haven't had it, basically you're awake, but you cannot move and sometimes experience auditory and visual hallucinations. I was aware of this, so I didn't have a full-on heart attack when I started hearing shuffling noises outside my tent, which continued and got louder and closer until the fabric of the tent itself was being touched by something. My computer hadn't yet died, so I could see my surroundings in the dim light of the screen. I watched the fabric compress as something pushed against it sporadically about 4 feet off the ground, then moved around the tent towards me. I watched 3 distinct impressions follow this creature around the side of the tent. It looked like a claw. I was terrified and filled with adrenaline, but another part of me remained calm, assuring my body it was all a dream. I couldn't do anything anyway, so my fear was pointless. But as I continued to observe it, my sleep paralysis began to fade, and I realized I could move. No longer so convinced I was dreaming, I reached over and shoved Luke awake. I tried to get him to look and see if there was really something there, but I must have sounded like I was sleep talking because he just rolled over and went back to sleep, waving me off. Eventually the rustling stopped, and I was tired and groggy enough that I quickly fell back asleep. In the morning I'd completely forgotten about it, that is, until my brother-in-law, who was in the other tent, call him Dean, said to us, "It's a good thing we put the dog in the car last night. There was a bear here while we were sleeping." Dean pointed out the tree where we'd strung up our trash, so animals wouldn't get into it, and the fresh, gaping claw marks about 9 feet up the trunk. It hit me like a truck. I had seen the bear and calmly watched it test the fabric of my tent 12 inches from my face. 2 stories for you. Both take place in the Rocky Mountain region. We don't like to camp in campgrounds because we're antisocial, and none of us care to share a campground with a stranger screaming kids waving around their flaming hot s'mores pokers. When we go camping, we do mild off-roading and camp in clearings away from other people. Just after high school, I and my friends decided to celebrate by going on a camping trip. We ended up leaving way later than we had planned. It was dark by the time we got up in the mountains. The camping spot was about an hour or so away from home. We didn't want to turn around, so we decided to just make do and set up camp in the first decent clearing we found and figure things out in the morning. We all set up our tents in the dark, moonless night and just went straight to bed. When we woke up, we realized that we had unwittingly set up camp on top of someone's abandoned attempt at a marijuana farm. Not wanting to deal with that shit, we packed up pretty quickly and moved on. Second story. It's a few years later, same group of friends. We set up camp in a little clearing surrounded by thick trees and settled around a campfire for the night. After it gets dark, we can hear rustling in the trees and occasionally catch a flash of campfire reflecting off eyes in the distance. We aren't worried. This isn't bear country, and this particular area is covered in deer. We had to stop a few times on the drive to this spot to let deer cross the road, and we noticed tons of hoof prints and deer trails near our camping site while we were setting up. We go to bed, and all night long we hear the snaps of twigs and leaves. They sound like they come pretty near the campsite a few times but back off when the dogs start barking. The next morning we find that there are fresh cougar prints skirting the edge of our campsite. It's pretty obvious the cougar was circling around us all night, sizing us up. We're dumb young adults and decide to test our luck. We stay a second night. That second night, we decided to take shifts sleeping, with a few of us staying up to watch guard with our shotgun ready and keep our fire tended during the night. I and my ex had the first half of the night. Occasionally we would see the yellow flash of eyes for a brief moment, and they'd disappear again. The dogs will not shut up. Maybe it's just paranoia setting in, but my ex swears he sees the cougar off in the trees. At this point, we all decide to just sleep in our cars and leave in the morning. The next morning rolls around, and our friends take the dogs out for a small hike and one last potty break while we brew some coffee. On the way back down the trail, they notice cougar tracks following theirs, and we're all convinced we're being stalked. We decided to fuck coffee, tore down camp as quickly as we could, and noped on out of there. I used to go on 3 to 5 day trips where my brother, father, and I would pack up our raft and float down various rivers in Montana, stopping to camp on the shore at night. It was getting late, and we decided we would pull off to camp as soon as we found a suitable place. The river we were on was fairly slow moving and winding, so it was often not possible to see around bends until you were already stuck with whatever river conditions were ahead. We came to one such bend, and the river made a sharp turn into a deep gully, about 30 feet of sheer rock on either side of us. Up ahead we spotted something in the middle of the river. As we floated closer, we realized that there were 2 grizzly bear cubs and a mama bear. We were trapped on the river, there wasn't enough time or shore for us to pull our raft out of the water. We had no choice but to keep floating directly towards them. We pulled our raft as far to the opposite side as we could, held our breath, and slowly floated on past, maybe 15 feet away from the bears. Nobody made a sound, and the mama bear just stared directly at us the entire time. It was incredible to see them up close, but the feeling of having almost no control over getting that close was intensely terrifying. Hiking/backpacking with 2 friends in Montana. We were probably 5 miles from the nearest paved road and had hiked around 2 miles from the end of the dirt road. The spot isn't well traveled and is quite nondescript. But we all enjoyed getting away from any crowds and being out relatively alone, so we always gravitated to areas like this for backcountry camping. We'd built a fire and hung out, then piled into our tent. All is normal, and we hadn't seen a soul, or any recent sign of people, since we left the paved road. I have some trouble sleeping and was sort of just lying there for maybe 30 minutes, and both my buddies were passed out. That's when it got weird. I hear from my side of the tent a murmuring, which I was certain was a person making sounds under their breath. Didn't sound like real words, but almost like someone drunk and mumbling gibberish. My first thought was one of my buddies sleep talking, but I listened closer and it was definitely coming from outside. I woke up my friend closest to me, and he woke up with a what? A little irritated, and at that moment the muttering stopped. I shushed him and whispered to him what I'd heard. We waited a second, and it started up again but seemed closer this time. He heard it too, but we didn't hear any sounds of movement. I can still hear the voice, and it really fucks with me even 10 years later. He gave me the what the fuck? Face and proceeded to gesture that he's going to unzip the door to see what's outside. Right as he starts moving the zipper, we hear what sounded like someone taking a huge gasp of air before diving into a pool. Seemingly from what was the opposite side of the tent, we heard the original muttering. We both froze for a second before he pushed his flashlight out and looked in that direction and screamed, "Who's out there?" We didn't see anything and never heard a single twig or any sound of movement. By this time my other friend had woken up, and we were still freaking out. We told him what was up and all took our lights out to see what the hell that was. We saw absolutely nothing at all. We were both up for a long while after, while the sleeping friend was out again fairly shortly thereafter. We didn't hear another odd sound at all, and in the morning there was no sign anyone had been there. We cut our trip to just that night and moved back to a campground the following day. We still have no idea who was outside our tent. The only thing that would even make a semblance of sense was an owl, bat, or another bird. But I've spent many nights outdoors in that habitat and am familiar with those noises. This was entirely different and, in my opinion, didn't come from any animal I'm aware of. Still gives me chills thinking about it. Eagle Scout, been on many campouts and hikes, and I scuba dive. Very experienced outdoors. Area. The island is fairly medium-sized. Large enough to support its own deer population, 40, but small enough to hike the circumference in a single day. The whole interior is up a 20-foot bluff from the beach, and it's Washington, so basically rainforest dense evergreens and ferns as tall as a person. Our campsite was up in the forest, about 30 feet back from an animal run down the bluff, which we used to access the beach. Story. I and some other kids took a trip to an island for the weekend. Chartered a Sea Scout boat to take us out and pick us up Sunday. We did island-wide things like a beach hike, swimming, etc. the usual. I stepped in deer poop barefoot, we made lunch, did some more swimming, started making dinner at dusk, and had a fire going. As we're sitting there chatting with our dinner wrapped in foil, I look up from the conversation quickly, just on a whim. If you have ever been camping in dense forest, you know it gets darker faster than a field. I could see the glow of the sunset over the water still, but the trees and everything were all black silhouettes. And there were eyes all around us. At least 15 pairs in total, all the way around outside the light of the cooking coals. All of them were yellow. Some of them were up in trees, some were peering between fern leaves, and one set was between us and the direction of the tent. I froze, and my sudden stop alerted my friends, who also just stared for a few seconds at the watchers around us. Luckily, one of them had thought to grab a flashlight before it got dark. He slowly pulls it out, points it at one pair, and flicks it on. It's a fucking raccoon. All the eyes were raccoons. The smell of our cooking drew them from all over the island. We ended up spending until like 2 o'clock just turning off all lights, waiting for eyes to show up, then flashing them with a big 1000 lumen stick I had. Even got one to fall out of a tree. I can explain it now, but at the time it was a terrifying experience. I was solo backpacking and decided to stop for the night as it was right around sunset. Got everything set up, and I heard a car on a road about 1,500 feet from my position. Honestly, I didn't even realize there was a road there because it was up a steep embankment and I couldn't see it. So I hear this car, then it slows, then it stops, then the doors open and close, and the car drives off. I hear a group of men talking, but they were too far away to make out what they were saying. By now the sun has set, and the men begin using flashlights. They appear to be descending the steep embankment towards me. I'm a little concerned, as nothing about this is adding up. I figure if they get any closer, I'll try to quietly escape and leave my gear. They stop about halfway down and then they start fucking digging with shovels. Now I'm shitting my pants. They dig for about an hour, then stop, then I hear the car return. They begin to ascend up the embankment, but before they do, they shine their flashlights down onto my position. I don't move a muscle, and they didn't seem to notice me. I just sat there, didn't move a muscle for at least an hour after they had gone. I packed up and moved about a 1/4 mile away, deeper into the woods and well off the trail, just in case they had seen me and were going to come back for me. The next day I hiked out, found a park ranger, and gave him a map that I had drawn of the area and where the digging had taken place. He asked me to accompany him to the spot, but I refused. I work as a park operator in British Columbia. I worked the night shift as their security and collections guy. One night it was fairly overcast and super dark. I was parked at the bottom of the road leading down to the campground. I had the windows rolled down and was playing around on my phone as my shift was almost over. Suddenly, out of my passenger side window, I hear the sound of crunching footsteps moving around. This wasn't anything that alarmed me, as we generally have bears in the area and other wildlife. I just kind of listened as whatever it was walked around while kind of lightly on edge about it. Then the sound started to pick up pace like it was running directly at the truck. It's pitch black, and I've got my hands up ready for something to jump through the side window of my truck out of the darkness. But just before I was sure it was going to make contact with the side of the truck, it just went dead silent. So I said no thanks, started up the truck, and zoomed up to the cabin to get away from whatever was going on there. So I'm already on edge to the max. I'm just thinking, lock the gate, go home. Yep, just lock the gate and go home. Well, prior to me leaving in my personal vehicle, I have to put the parked truck's key away in the shop inside this fenced off compound, which is just so conveniently unlit. So I whip out my cell phone, turn on the crappy LED, and start my way over to the shed. I'm kind of like trying not to freak myself out, but any little tick and leaf crunch has me jittering at this point. I walk through the compound gate, and as I'm walking by the sort of motor pool area, I hear this horrid, loud screech like an alarm trigger on. At this point my body went into fight or flight, fists in the air, half about to crap myself. The sound persisted, and I recognized that it was the sound the golf carts make when they are left in reverse. But generally you'd know if you left it on because you'd hear that sound when you parked it. So now my mind is thinking, okay, what the hell turned that on? So I sneak over there slowly toward the horrid sound, scanning with my phone light, scared out of my gourd. I run up really quick and pull the reverse lever off while half expecting it to be some sort of axe murder trap from a movie. But nothing. I literally tossed the parked truck key at the shed and ran for my truck, started it up, turned every single off-road light and backup light on that I had, and locked the gate faster than I've ever done. I even pathetically checked my backseat to make sure that my safe place didn't have anyone hiding in it. Looking back, I'm thinking what a silly-ass night, but at the same time, retelling the story makes me slightly uneasy. Working in a park is great, but Jesus, night shift can be some kind of creepy. I have been hiking since I was a kid, so I have a number of stories. The most terrifying one happened when I was 16. I just got my license, and I decided to go on a 3-day solo hike. On my second day, I was stopping at a river to collect/purify water. When I was getting my water, I heard what sounded like a wind chime on the other side of the river. The map of the state park said there were no cabins or campsites across the river. I, being a curious teenager, set down my pack and crossed the river. On the other side, I walked back about 20 feet and saw probably about a dozen small houses made of sticks, bark, logs, etc. The houses were only a couple of feet big. I kept walking on a path that the houses were on. This wasn't a state trial, and it led down a small hill. At the bottom there was a house made the same as the others but full size. Attached to the front was the wind chime. From afar, I saw animal pelts. I assumed the guy living there hunted them and just had the pelt on display. But when I got closer, I saw they were whole rotten carcasses. I got the fuck out of there. Grabbed my bag and hiked through part of the night to get as far away as possible. I couldn't really sleep, I kept hearing the wind chime. I think it was just in my head. The next morning, I still had a day's hike till I got to the end where the rangers were. When I got there, I told them what I saw and pointed it out on the map. Working SAR in the Scandinavian mountain range, we were called out to assist with finding a family that had gotten lost. We did flybys with a helicopter and managed to spot an abandoned campsite behind a small ridge on the side of a low mountain. I should note that this is not an extremely remote area. It's common for families to hike here, often with kids. The trails are well maintained and easy to follow. We marked the spot with a smoke canister from the helicopter and call it in to the ground team before looking for a place to set down. After about 20 minutes, the ground team found the site using the green smoke pillar. But no campsite. The first thought was that the smoke canister had gone downhill a bit or that the smoke had pocketed somewhere else. But they found the actual canister. We also had photos and coordinates of the campsite, which had an old backpack and some other old items. It definitely appeared abandoned. But that same site was gone when Team 3 arrived at it. Police officially called off the search as the investigation landed on the family not wanting to be found and seemingly had cleared out the site between us marking it and SAR arriving. This seems strange to me, though, and I'm not sure why they would. We weren't connected to the case again after that, and to my knowledge, they were never found.